Okay, good morning, Year 7s. Hope everyone had a fantastic weekend. Thank you very much for all the work you've handed in. If I could just give a little bit of general feedback for the work you've handed in, really good. Just a few little things some people are doing similar mistakes on. So just make sure you have your title, your date and CW underlined like you normally would in lesson. And when it comes to the note-taking part, you can obviously use the notes that are on the slides, but try and add a little bit extra information. So maybe do a little bit of research on Google, or pause the video and listen to the words I'm saying, and then maybe add some of those words into your notes as well. Just kind of make your note-taking a little bit more detailed. But the describe question, really good. Most students got 3-4 marks for that question, so that was fantastic work, and some really good stuff that I saw. A couple of people missing the work, so maybe if you could just finish it today, and then you can start this lesson tomorrow, which will be due for next Sunday. Okay, thank you. So this is the title for today's lesson. How did Martin Luther start the Reformation? Okay. Okay, so a quick overview of what we're going to be covering today, because there's a lot in today's lesson. We're going to have to look at who Martin Luther was. Now, we're not confusing him with Martin Luther King, who was a 20th century American pastor who was fighting for civil rights for Black people in America. This is a completely different Martin Luther. They're not even any relation. In fact, the American Martin Luther was actually named after this Martin Luther, because Martin Luther King's father was very religious and he wanted his son to be religious as well, which he was, because he went on to become a pastor. And then we're going to look at how Martin Luther opposed the church. So we looked at the criticisms of the church in the last lesson. Now we're going to be looking at how Martin Luther actually voiced his opposition to the church, because Martin Luther wasn't very happy with the church and he wanted to make it well known. So we'll look at that, and he actually published his criticisms in something called the 95 Theses. We'll look at those in a little bit. We're going to practice an exam question. You will have done this exam question in my class before, so we're going to have a look at how to structure an answer to that question, and then we'll look at the consequences of Martin Luther's actions on Europe. You can see a picture there of a war. This is about 100 years after Martin Luther, but it was actually Martin Luther's actions that indirectly led to this war. It was known as the 30 Years' War, and probably the most destructive war in Europe's history before the First and Second World War of the 20th century. So we won't be actually looking at the 30 Years' War, but it's just to show you how impactful the Reformation was on European history in this time period. Okay, so let's look at the story of Martin Luther first. So what I want you to do now, I'm going to give you a quick history of Martin Luther and what he did. And I want you to create a flow chart, a timeline, or bullet pointed notes based on this lecture. I'm not going to put any writing up on the screen. So you're just going to have to pause the video, listen to what I'm saying, and just write descriptions and notes in your notes. Okay, so on your Word document or on the piece of paper if you're taking a photograph. So Martin Luther was a German monk. He was originally training to be a lawyer, but apparently he had a apparition. He was out in a thunderstorm, lightning struck, and he believed God was speaking to him. So he stopped learning to become a lawyer, and he joined a monastery and became a monk and devoted the rest of his life to God. He believed that was his calling. He believed that's what God wanted him to do. And he was very religious, and he took religion very seriously. Now, he came from a country that today is called Germany, but in the early 1500s, when Martin Luther was alive, Germany didn't exist. Germany only exists since 1871. So Germany was actually divided up into about 330 little tiny areas, kind of like counties in Britain. Okay, and one of these areas was called Mansfeld, about 2-hour drive from Berlin. And that's where Martin Luther came from. Well, he lived there till he was 15, and then he moved after that. But that's where he was born, and that's where he was raised. Now, when Martin Luther was a monk, he made a trip to Rome. Okay, Rome was like the main pilgrimage, and it still is to this day. It's one of the main pilgrimage sites for Catholics. If Catholics want to go on a holy journey, they'll go somewhere like Jerusalem or Rome, because Rome is where St. Peter, Jesus' apostle, started the Catholic Church, okay, the first pope. So he goes to Rome anyway, and he sees, this is of course the picture we studied in the last lesson, St. Peter's Basilica. Now this was being built in Rome in this time period. So he sees St. Peter's Basilica, and I mean, this is an enormous building, a building larger than Martin Luther would ever have seen in his life before, with splendor and wealth, the likes of which he would never have seen before. And where most people looked at this and they were absolutely inspired and thought it was amazing that this magnificent building could exist because they came from little villages in Germany or France or England, Martin Luther looked at it and thought it was completely wrong. He's like, that's not how the church should be. The gold, the marble, all the Latin. And he didn't feel that's how the church should be. One of the main reasons for this, because he was looking at how are they paying for this really big church? How are the church so wealthy? And he knew about indulgences, and he saw how many indulgences were being sold in Rome. They were constantly selling them. And he knew that the Pope was building these massive cathedrals by selling indulgences to people. So they weren't actually selling the indulgences because they wanted people's sins to be forgiven. They were just selling these indulgences so they could build bigger and bigger cathedrals, churches, basilicas, and give money to the Pope for himself. So the Pope was basically taking this money for himself. There were three other things that he saw the bishops and the popes doing in Rome as well. And this was simony, nepotism, and pluralism. Okay, so kind of three complicated words. Now we look at simony first. And simony is basically where you can buy a church office. So let's say you want to be a bishop. Rather than being really, really good at your job, you just give the Pope a load of money. So if you were wealthy, you could just buy being a bishop. Okay, and he was very critical of this because he said that just led to really bad people becoming bishops. The other one was nepotism, where church figures actually gave important jobs to their family. Okay, so if you were a bishop, then you could give the job of being a priest to your son. And you might say, oh, I thought they had to they had to spend 7 years to become a priest. Well, some of these bishops were just ignoring that and then just giving really important positions to their children, their brothers, etc., things like that. And the last one was pluralism, where you had one person who had many different church positions. So one guy could be a bishop and a priest and all these different positions within the church. And the more positions he had, the more money he had. So Martin Luther looked at the Catholic Church, the indulgences, simony, the nepotism, the pluralism, and he said they're just taking advantage of it. It just looked like one big criminal organization to Martin Luther. So when he came back from Germany, he was very, very angry. He expected to go to Rome and feel closer to God. And all he saw was indulgences, people buying positions within the church, people appointing their idiotic children to bishops and priests within Rome. And he said, this is not right. This is not what the church should be about. And he wanted to let people know how angry he was. Now, obviously, in modern times, if you want to get some information out there, you can use social media, you can use television, radio, and newspapers. Well, obviously in the 16th century, in the early 1500s, they didn't have that luxury. So what Martin Luther did was he sat down and he wrote a list of 95 problems he had with the church. And he called these the 95 theses. Theses is kind of like an idea that you put forward. And he said, these are the 95 problems that I see with the church. Some of them he knew before, and some of them he saw when he was in Rome. And he was furious when he came back. So he did a lot of meditating, a lot of thinking about this, and this is what he did. Now, how is he going to get that out there? Well, at the time, he was a professor in a university. So he got the 95 theses. He went to the door of the university. The church was on the university grounds, and he nailed the 95 theses to the door. So anytime somebody was going into the church, they would actually read the theses. And he knew these were shocking. I mean, one or two of these theses on their own could be enough to get you thrown out of the Catholic Church and almost certainly executed. And here's he coming up with 95 problems. So he obviously had to think quite a great deal about these. They were quite short, so only a couple of sentences for each problem, but each one was a specific problem. So the Catholic Church thought they were like this great organization who were bringing people closer to God. And he was able to come up with 95 problems, not one or two problems, 95. So we've only looked at like simony, nepotism, pluralism, indulgences, building massive churches. We've only looked at 4 or 5 problems, and we're not going to look at all 95, but that's how many he was able to find in the Catholic Church. Okay, so I want you to pause the video now. Here is a word gap of Martin Luther and what he did. So just write this completely, rewrite it into your notes, and then unpause the video and move on to the next slide. Okay, here's a quick video. I'm going to get a quick coffee now, and I'm going to let you watch this 5-minute video. So take any notes that you can on the video, and for your heading, you might have Martin Luther video, underline that heading, subheading, and then take notes on the video, and I'll be back with you in 5 minutes. Okay, excellent. Okay, so hopefully you've taken a few notes on that. Maybe pause that video. It gives you a little bit of an overview about Martin Luther. Now we're going to do an inference question now. So this is the question, and this is it comes up on the GCSE paper, but it's one of these 4-mark questions that I think you guys are more than capable of doing, especially after seeing your fantastic work on the describe 2 features question. So this question asks you to infer 2 things that you can learn about something. So give 2 things you can infer from source A about Martin Luther's attitudes to the Catholic Church. So his view of the Catholic Church, it's basically asking you. Now, here's source A. So we're just going to look through it really quickly. I'll just talk you through it and you can study some of these theses. So these are 3 of Martin Luther's theses. We're not going to go through all 95. So I've picked out 3. So this is 1. Those who believe that they can go to heaven because they have indulgence letters will be eternally damned together with their teachers. So this is Martin Luther saying, you teachers, you Catholic Church priests and bishops selling indulgences, you're going to hell. That's basically what he's telling the Catholic Church. Now, Pope, bishops, cardinals, priests are all responsible for selling these indulgences. So he's basically telling the entire Catholic Church, or at least all of those members that support the selling of indulgences, that they're going to hell. Now that's definitely probably a burning at the stake offense within the Catholic Church. So I think that's one of the most serious theses. And people who stood at the door of the church in the University of Wittenberg and read that would have been absolutely shocked. Absolutely shocking that someone could be so outwardly against the Catholic Church in this time period. Number 62, he says, the true treasure of the church. Now here he's kind of taking a dig at the basilica and the gold that was in the Vatican City in Rome. He would have looked at that and said, that's not real treasure. That's just superficial treasure that people are worshipping when they should be worshipping the true treasure. And the true treasure, according to Martin Luther, was the most holy gospel of the glory and grace of God. So in other words, the Bible. He said, really, it's the gospel of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John that depicts the life of Jesus. That's the true treasure of the church, not St. Peter's Basilica, not the fantastic paintings that hang on the wall or the beautiful sculptures. They are just superficial, and it's actually the Bible that people should be concentrating on. And number 86, he says, why does the Pope not build a basilica with his own money rather than with the money of poor believers? So he's basically criticizing the Pope, one of the most influential individuals in the world, okay, who has the power to have people kicked out of the church and more or less executed, and he is criticizing him for building these churches. Now, before we look at an answer, and I give you a model answer, and then you can do one of your own. An inference must be something that you can learn from the source. So you don't repeat what's in the source, and that's really, really important. It should be answered in 2 sentences. The first sentence should be the inference. You say, I can infer, and then you give the inference. I'm going to give you an example in a moment. And then the second sentence should be a quote from the source that supports the inference. Okay, so 1 sentence, I can infer. Second sentence, I can see this in the source when it says, and then you give an example. Okay, so let's look at an example. So here's the one that I'm going to do. I'm going to infer something from in thesis number 32. Those who believe they can go to heaven because they have indulgences would be eternally damned together with their teachers. So first sentence, the inference. I can infer that Martin Luther believed that the Catholic Church, because remember the question asks you attitudes to the Catholic Church. Yeah, attitudes to the Catholic Church. So this is what my inference has to be about. I can infer that Martin Luther believed that the Catholic Church, and this is my inference, were spreading false information about getting into heaven. Okay? Or we're lying to the people, would be a little bit easier, but it would still be sufficient to get you 1 mark. I know this because it says, and here's my quote from the source. Okay, so you can see I've written, those who believe they can go to heaven because they have indulgence letters will be eternally damned together with their teachers. And I've basically just put this in as a quote to support my answer. So that's what you kind of want to do. Just make sure for the inference, you don't just repeat what's in the source. You kind of have to kind of paraphrase, but work out what Martin Luther means by that. So you could do number 86 here and do 1 inference based on number 86. So you could maybe talk about how Martin Luther believed the Catholic Church was very corrupt, or the Catholic Church was too wealthy, or the Catholic Church shouldn't be spending people's money on superficial things, something along those lines. Or you could do the second one and talk about the Bible. Okay. So maybe pause and rewind some of that if you need to get some more clarity about how to answer the inference section. Okay, we're going to really quickly look at the consequences of the 95 Theses, and we should be finished then. So this had massive consequences for the next hundreds and hundreds. I mean, arguably, you could still say they're having some consequences. There was lots of troubles between Protestants and Catholics in Northern Ireland, all the way up until you could even say today, but definitely all the way up until the 1990s. Okay, Protestants and Catholics were fighting over religious freedoms and political control in Northern Ireland. So you could say what Martin Luther did all those years ago has had consequences that have lasted for hundreds of years in Europe. And it's really hard to I think this is why it's such a significant topic to learn, because of the amount of impact it's had on European politics and history. So let's look at some of the immediate consequences back in that time period. So the first one that we're going to look at is in 1440, something was invented called the printing press. So about 50 years before Martin Luther comes on the scene. Now, before Martin Luther, before the printing press, if you wanted to spread information, you actually had to handwrite it down. So if you wanted to copy a Bible, you actually had to get the Bible out, get a feather, get some ink, and actually rewrite the whole Bible. Now, as you can imagine, that took a lot of time to do. So there weren't actually that many Bibles in existence. Now, a guy called Johannes von Gutenberg invented something called the printing press. You know what a printer is. You just click Control P and it sends it to the printer, and then you have your homework printed out. You can take a photo and put it on Show My Homework. Well, obviously they didn't have that technology in the early 1500s, but this printing press could essentially copy a book in a few days. Okay, so much quicker than the laborious task of actually handwriting out all these books. So Martin Luther's 95 Theses, one of those could be printed. That was quite short, so you could print one of these in a day. You could print numerous copies in a day, and those copies could be sent all over Europe. So Martin Luther's ideas were spread very, very quickly because of the invention of the printing press. You could make an argument, if you had a debate about what was the most important invention in the world, I think the printing press will be there in the top 10 or 20 of the most important inventions, because it allowed knowledge to be spread much more quickly. The second was people stopped paying indulgences. So the printing press published all these 95 Theses. They start being spread all over Europe. And then people say, well, he says don't pay indulgences. That actually makes a lot of sense to me. So people stop paying indulgences. Now, as worried as the Catholic Church are about Martin Luther's criticisms, they're really worried when it starts to hit their pocket. And it starts to lose the amount of money they're getting from selling these indulgences. Now they're getting really annoyed with this upstart German monk who's spreading all this dangerous information. In about 1524, there was a massive revolt in Europe known as the Peasants' Revolt. So the peasants in Germany or in the German states heard all these criticisms Martin Luther was saying, and they had a massive revolt. Some of it was to do with they were angry with how they were being treated, but a lot of it was to do with religious reasons. There was about 300,000 peasants, maybe even more, and they had a massive revolt where they tried to get rid of all the noblemen. Now, the noblemen obviously grabbed all their armies together, really frightened about all these peasants who were rebelling for religious and political reasons. And in the end, about 300,000 peasants were slaughtered and murdered because they just weren't well organized and didn't have good enough equipment to fight the nobles. So that peasants' revolt was almost a direct consequence of Martin Luther's 95 Theses. And the last one we'll look at is one of the theses said, and this will be the subject for probably the start of year 8. He said the Pope should not be the head of the church. Okay, he said that's crazy that some guy in Rome should be the head of the church in England or Germany. He's like, for him, an English king knew what was best for English people. A German prince knew what was best for his people. Spanish king knew what was best for his people. So Martin Luther said, actually the kings, the queens, the princes of the individual countries should be the head of the church and not the Pope. Now, some kings looked at this and said that's a bad idea, because I really like the Catholic Church. But some kings, most notably Henry VIII, who I'm sure you've heard of, was looking for a divorce at this time period that the Pope wouldn't give him. So Henry started to really pay attention to Martin Luther's ideas. And we'll look at that a little bit later. We're going to go back and look at the Tudors in the next lesson. But that's the main consequences. And that consequence, I think, is the most important one for what we're going to be doing. Henry VIII's decision to leave the Catholic Church, because it was Martin Luther that actually gave him that idea. Okay, so that's another reason why it's really important for British history. So I'm going to leave the consequences up on the screen. What I want you to do is read through these consequences, and I want you to rank them in order of importance. So what do you think is the most important consequence, second most important, third most important, all the way down to the 5? So there's 5 consequences there, and I want you to rank them in importance. Okay, so that's it for today's lesson. I'm going to put a link to that video on Show My Homework as well, just in case there's anything wrong with the sound or video quality of that. So make sure you watch the video, complete all those tasks, and just do exactly as you did for last week's lesson, taking photos, putting a Word document up, and I look forward to reading all your work. So have a really good week, and we will speak again next Monday. Thank you.